So as you will hear, I'm not born Canadian. I'm a migrant, and I settled here because I liked one value in Canada while I was doing my PhD at Western, because people respect each other here better than they do in Europe. I come from a mixed family. My dad was the son of a communist who didn't know how to read or write before the war and learned during the Resistance. And my mom is the hidden daughter of a Jewish lady. And I moved out of France because I had enough of being called little Jew, basically. So that's to tell you a little bit, because you know, I guess you get a sense of why I would be sensitive to some of the issues here. I stumbled onto, I guess, water one day because I got a phone call asking me to talk about fiscal intergovernmental relations. I don't know very much about fiscal relations. I've never really studied that part. The only thing that I know is intergovernmental relations. I studied the systems in many different countries of Europe, and I studied also the mechanisms that are placed between the different countries of Europe. So I know, for instance, how it works in the European Union very well. And I can tell you the history without PowerPoints. But when I started looking at you know, fiscal intergovernmental relations here in Canada, especially with regard to bans, I have to say I was really shocked. And some of you may have read the paper that I wrote you know, a few years ago now. And it's a single shot. It's the only time I've ever written anything on the Canadian system, but I did what I can do best, which is to compare what I was observing with what I knew quite well. So I looked at the French, the Mexican, the Australian cases, for instance, and I compared the systems. And I looked inside the bureaucracy. How do bureaucracies basically manage these fiscal intergovernmental relations? And I'm going to start my talk by basically just telling you a little bit about, you know, what I observed here. So I have to make this work. It's the, no, it's not working. Okay, one more. Maybe it's just slow.
Yeah, maybe there you go. Yeah.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll just make sure I keep it this way. So I started looking at this from the perspective of a student of the French system. You know, the French system is highly centralized. To this day, the French state has kept complete control over fiscal issues. When the French state decides to give power to regions or cities, one thing it doesn't do is give fiscal powers. It has given some very specific taxes to the lower level governments, but it controls policies basically from the perspective of redistribution. So I send that city so much money every year, basically. And then I used to work for the French government in the Ministry of Industry. I worked for a number of years, and some of my best friends were sub-prefects. These are the people who go in and control how municipalities do their accounting. These are the people who also go after municipal council and basically say, all of this is illegal, we're going to send you to jail, or we're having you audited, and then you're responsible, and so on and so forth. And what I was observing in Canada is basically a system where there was much dependency and much control, so much control even, that to a certain extent it's counterproductive. And so I, you know, in the conclusion, I am quite, I think, forceful when I say it's a straitjacket. It basically holds all the different bands into a straitjacket. It prevents a lot of things from happening. I'm going to illustrate this a tiny bit. First of all, one of the classic ways that you find both in Mexico and France is that you also find it actually to a certain extent in Australia, is that you can delegate powers, but you don't delegate money with the powers. And then you make the local level responsible for the additional cost. And obviously the local power is stuck. And so you know the rules, right? In the paper I detail them. But basically, INAC budget increases 2% per year, and Indigenous population in Canada increases over a period of time, let's say by 16% or 20%. And all of the programs are basically strangled very progressively. This is a technique that has existed for the longest time, and governments can use it to control all of the policies that they concentrate or decentralize with magnitude. This is just... So one of the things that I use in the paper to illustrate these difficulties is, the discussion around the Kelowna communique, and some of the things that I found that I thought were quite shocking, one of which was that when we look at the average per capita expenditure of the Canadian government for Indigenous population is about half that of non-Indigenous people. And that I checked again last night, that number has been checked by StatsCan and verified since then. So we still have this issue. And you'll see in one of my slides a little later, I looked at Australia as well, and there it's the reverse situation. But it's very interesting to see that in Canada, we certainly have that negative trend where the central government has actually used the budget to systematically control policies and this kind of, whoa, this is a little bit too fast, okay. So there are two things that I wanted to discuss a little bit more today, because these were my last conclusions. These are, I think, very important at the end of the paper, is that there are two parallel goals that are set basically by the Canadian government and that we see throughout. One is to increase accountability. It's the idea that you're responsible for the money that you're given. In the paper, I argue that obviously you can ask for more accountability, but you also have to allow that accountability to be funded. You have to have resources to be accountable. And I'll illustrate, for instance, how it's done in the Australian case, just so you get a perspective on this. I think it's quite interesting here. The other one is to maximize your own resources, that band be able to maximize their own resources. And I think there is a bit of movement here in that area, but I want to discuss it too. As I say here, however, is, right there, I think it's really important to remain aware of this, is that the movement is extremely slow. And since I have been able to look at the data 7-8 years ago, and I looked again at the data for this presentation today, I have to admit that, when you have on the one side about 9 and something billion, and on the other side you have a little less than 100 million. We are here for the long haul, but there is a small opening here. And I think that, in a way, property tax in Canada might be that small opening. We have to be careful, however, and I'll discuss this more in a few minutes, as to what system we will choose, because they are not equal. So when we look at the First Nation Tax Commission today, there are 165 First Nation, or 27%, that have property tax jurisdiction or are developing taxation. There are two venues, the FMA or the Indian Act. I'll detail them in the next slide. And there are 220, about 1/3 of the total number of bands in the country, that are basically on the schedule of the First Nations Tax Commission. Altogether, the two ways that are, organizing here total about $85 or $86 million of tax collection. This is the small window of opportunity that we can discuss. There's also the ability to collect fees. And there are court cases, as I will detail, that show that that ability is also written in the court cases. So we can see firmly that, it's a small venue. It gives hope. So the history is, as I said earlier, some of these evolutions, the way I look at all of these, I assume it works and it doesn't. The way I look at all of these instruments here is that we can see an ability to organize. We can see that there are new instruments that are appearing that provide resources, knowledge, right? And ways to interact and to influence policy. So, First Nations government have regulatory control and exclusive jurisdiction for taxation of leasehold land on reserve, and so on and so forth. You can see that evolution very progressively. But one of the things that we see until the 1990s is that basically we are in front of a situation where there is generally very little knowledge. And why am I saying this way, a little bit brutal, right? Is that basically we also have to give time to time. These things take time because it means that people have to be educated, you have to acquire new skills, and you have to manage complex systems that are completely new to a community or a culture. When we look at the most recent legislation, 2005, I was working on the paper in 2006. It was published in 2000. It was kind of finalized in 2007. It got published in 2008. You can see even more policy instruments that appear. For instance, the First Nation Tax Commission has powers over provincial ministries, right, basically to help First Nations. And you can see all of these policy instruments that are progressively appearing and starting to work. And if you look at their website, what is really interesting is to see they actually are making progress. So in terms of fiscal intergovernmental relations, there are tools today that were non-existent 10 years ago. But again, what we're looking at here is that policy tools, these instruments that we have, take a lot of time to actually give results. It's a little bit like snow that melts. You see the countryside and it's white for the longest time until there is no more snow. But you don't see the thickness of the snow melt on a daily basis. And I think it's really important to be aware of this. These kind of policy changes take a lot of time. So in sum, I say the development of a number of policy instruments, can help and should help First Nation increase knowledge of policies of development property tax administration. It's basically a fight against knowledge. The faster you can learn, the faster you can train people, the more skills they have, the more benefits to your communities, basically. Let me detail this a tiny bit. I don't like this section of the talk very much, but I thought it was necessary that I discuss this. Section 63 of the Indian Act and then the First Nation Fiscal Management Act, they're two very different legislations. And I'll be very quick describing them. The first one is the easy route, and it's the one that is the most practiced today, and is the one that I think is also the hardest. It has a dead end put in place. It allows you to collect taxes, which is great. You cannot leverage any of that money, basically, unless you go to private sector banks. So you pay higher interests, and you cannot pull your resources. So you are not a true local government, in a way, if you compare yourself to a local government. Right? When I discussed this for the first time with the BC financial authorities, for instance, to find out what interest rate they were negotiating in New York City, they said, well, we pull 120 municipalities, we have all of this money, and then we can leverage at 7-8%. and the interest rate is a fraction. In other words, they have the ability to leverage a lot of money. I think that when we look at the 400 million that are being raised today by the FNTC, let me move this. It just doesn't move when I press. So I just describe this, I'm going to be here. When we look at what they are able to pool today, 400 million, it probably is because of the amount of money that is raised by First Nation who decide to work under the FMA. So what is the main difference? The FMA process requires real skills and training. It requires a lot of rigor. It's a step-by-step certification. And critics of the system actually argue that the certification process is harder for a First Nation government than it would be for a local government, like the city of Victoria or a smaller place like Sydney in British Columbia, for instance. What is the competitive advantage I see, however, is that once you're in, you can leverage real money at very low interest rates. And as I say here, you can also basically benefit from tax deductions. So it is the way to go. And I think for First Nations government, I think this is really a true opening because of what I'm going to discuss now. If you want to be able to partner government to government, you have to have some basic own resources that you completely control. Let me illustrate this a little bit. There are a couple of things I want to go over fairly quickly that I think are interesting. So this is the summary of what I said. When we look at the conclusion of the 2008 paper, First Nations have increased their accountability generally. I don't really discuss this, but they have maximized their own revenue sources for sure. And to a certain extent, what we can say, though, is that it's a fairly small amount of success, 20 to 27% in nearly 10 years. If we look at Australia, and this is the kind of the case I want to discuss for a few minutes now, there's been all kind of discussion in Australia because of the issue that is right here. What is this? The issue that is right here. Basically, Australia spends twice as much on its First Nations, Aboriginal people, than it does per capita, than it does on Australians, other Australians, I guess. And the system is very inefficient. And so they have a conundrum. But when you look at World Bank reports on the why they have a conundrum, right? It's an outside observer. You can read it like me. I'm really bad with this thing. Somebody else should almost handle it. The reporting exercise is so constraining that sometimes you wonder how people can do anything else. You have to report on grants that are $1,000, and basically for every action that you have to write a report. So you write 20,000 reports, right? Canada, to a certain extent, has tried to have different ways of dealing with this. Some First Nations are still basically what I call under the tutelage of auditors. In the paper, I talk about this a little bit. In Australia, it's a real issue. Now, what do we learn from the literature? What do we learn from the literature that looks at these issues? we learned that these agreements that link, let's say, First Nations in Canada with their federal government should actually be inspired by a number of governance rules that have to be negotiated both ways, bottom-up and top-down. The literature around the world on this today in social science is not even a literature that questions all the issues. We know that it works. I'm just going to give you a reference to this. Wong, for instance, in 2012, documents 400 cases, 30 billion in 94 different countries, which is the work of the World Bank. And in every single case, the general principles that come out are right there. Devolution of powers, functions, and resources is a must. Strong engagement of the constituents is necessary as well, right? Representative organization play a key role, and governance functions are critical. In other words, when I talk about the top-down, bottom-up principles that we have here in organizing and managing intergovernmental relations, we have basically set rules that tell you you have to negotiate equal to equal, and you have to respect these different principles. Let me illustrate this a bit more. I took the recent document that came out in 2015, Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada published the Canada Fiscal Approach to Self-Government Arrangements. And I asked myself a very simple question. Is that a top-down or a bottom-up paper? And I just took the first page to illustrate my points. Set goals, share, finance. I mean, I just took the words to organize this, but basically it's a top-down system. And it's a system that reproduces a straitjacket. It's a system that doesn't really partner with any one of the First Nations it would contract with. It's a system that has to be rewritten. So here where I think I can contribute some ideas. If you look at the way it's done in Europe, where you have government-to-government partnership basically today, right? 28 different governments. I know it's not very much, but it's over 260 regions and 150,000 municipalities. Okay? The annual budget they have today is almost half of the EU budget, right? So about 400 billion. It's like a huge amount of money. And what I find remarkable is the precision with which certain principles are being discussed. So the principles that they have here, I hope I'm not going to press to get out of this. Oh, see? Smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth. If you want to understand what smart, sustainable, and inclusive growth is, you have to read 20 pages. That's the way it's done in the European Union. It means we really agree that these three principles have to organize all of our contracts. If you want to read the contract, which I'm going to illustrate now, between the European Union bureaucracy and Ireland, it's a 265 pages document. But it starts by stating those three principles. And it organizes and sets what the federal, if you want, or confederal, or union level wants, which is, in a way, highlighted here. Reduce unemployment, develop research and development, and so on and so forth. Now, in the paper that I wrote in 2008, the way I framed all of this is that obviously governments decentralize, whether it is towards First Nation bands or lower-level governments in Europe, It's because it has an economic rationale behind it. So the fiscal transfers should not be seen as equalization as much as they should be seen as investments into human capital. So the EU looks at this and says, well, then we have to have very specific targets, and for all those targets, we negotiate. Think how you would do this at the level of the band. If the federal government came to you and said, we have to agree on principles, what principle would you want to put forward? Do you think solidarity, like in the EU, or sustainability? I mean, the principle of solidarity is in inclusive growth. That's the principle behind it. Smart, it's because they want to forward, they want to promote, basically, new industries, innovative industries, and obviously they have sustainable because it's a major issue for them. Let's assume you would want to put forward the sustainable principle as one that would drive all of the development that you'd want to do. How do you put this then very concretely? And how would this be negotiated? I need to jump over that slide. There. Is it good? So here what you have is basically the indicators. So you have principles on the one hand, and then you have the indicators on the other hand, and you can see it's a fairly concise list of indicators. If you read all the literature published, for instance, by my colleague Jim McDavid on performance measurement, you know that if you have more than performance 15 measures, you're actually too ambitious, and that with 15, you're supposed to be able to control any large organization. The EU puts this in practice here. And so they have targets. But what I think is really interesting is the spread below the Irish column. So when you look at the Irish column, you see very clearly that for the Irish government, it's been set up in a different manner. So this is the kind of things that are being discussed. We're not talking here about straitjackets that have to do with the proper management of some pennies, but how we together achieve certain welfare, social, economic, educational goals. This is government-to-government relations. This is the way the EU sees it. But, as I was saying during a break, you realize these countries are not countries that have been colonized. These are completely decolonized countries. They actually have no sense of what it is to have been colonized, right? The way I look at this is that's the model that could help. It's the largest, the greatest, the most ambitious economic development model today in the world. And it's extremely sophisticated, and there is a vast literature on what works, what doesn't work, and how to put this in place. We can also do something else. There. We could also say that we look at other countries, and I started doing this for this talk, and I decided that I was not going to detail this too much. Look at how progress has gone in Bolivia and in Nunavut, and so on and so forth, which would tell us what are the difficulties that we have had, or recognize similar difficulties. But the day that we have self-government with our own set of laws, and that we want government-to-government relations, I think we need to teach the federal government to rethink the role of its bureaucracy in this regard. And I mean, it's really a way where the government has to completely change its own approach. The EU can be just a model. Case studies are there then to give people ideas, and then you'd have to go to work. Thank you.